Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the first of our strategic cereal farm summer activities and to our webinar and research update days. It's great to have you with us, and our first session today is all about what's going on over on the strategic cereal farm in the east, hosted by Brian Barker, based down in Suffolk. So we're really pleased that you're able to join us today. We've got Emily Pope, my colleague at AHDB, and Brian alongside the NIAB team that are here to share with you what's been going on farm up to date in this harvest year. So just before we start, sadly we can't see you or hear you, but you're very much a part of today. So if you've got any questions or want to get in touch, if you pop your questions in the questions box that you should see in the panel on your side, we'll be able to answer them and make sure that your questions are asked as we go through the session. We're here today until 10 o'clock, hopefully. We've got plenty to get through, but we'll make sure there's time for questions and things at the end as well. The session is being recorded, so if you wanted to look back, that will be sent to you on a link via email tomorrow, or it will go on our AHDB Cereals and Oilseeds YouTube channel as well. All of us today have a Twitter account, so if you want to keep up to date with what's going on and what Aoife's going to be doing over in June, or how harvest goes with Will and what the varieties look like, please feel free to follow us on our Twitter accounts and hashtag strategic farm will link you up with what's going on across the country as well. There are basis and ROSO points available for this webinar. If you'd like to claim them in that same questions box, if you pop your name, your basis account number and your postcode, and for NAROSO, your name, NAROSO number, your date of birth and your postcode, we'll make sure those are allocated for you. If you're watching this webinar back and would like to claim basis and ROSO points, if you email ke.events@ahdb.org.uk with those details, we'll make sure those are credited for you as well. So the plan for this morning, I'm going to shortly hand over to Brian, who's going to give you a season overview of how this harvest season has gone so far, the ups and downs of the weather, as I'm sure you've all found on your farms, and a bit of overview of an activity. And then we're going to hand over to our colleagues at NIAB, who've been kindly leading the research work going on, and they're going to talk you through the four main areas of work that we're doing. So Will Smith, who's trials manager at NIAB, has been looking after the managed lower inputs and varieties trial. We're looking at fungicides and tea timing. Nathan Morris, who's the farming systems and soils specialist at NIAB, has been looking after our cover crops and water quality work. Aoife O'Driscoll, who's their crop protection scientist, has been looking at our flowering strips and how that works with pests and natural enemy numbers. And David Clark, who's soils and farming systems technician at NIAB, has been looking after our marginal land. Really interesting work and analysis, not on farm, David, but crunching all those numbers that have come from on farm. And as I say, Emily Pope, who's Senior Knowledge Transfer Manager, is going to talk to you about what's happening going forward and what's going on across the network. And we'll be here until 10 o'clock. So I think just for me is to say we're now 4 years in, Brian, to our strategic farm journey. There's a lot that's happened to date, and hopefully many of you have followed us along the way. I think we're kind of, it's great, it's kind of all coming together, isn't it, Brian and team, about what we've learned so far, where we've kind of got to, finding some really interesting numbers. And I think this year, you know, working with a team, we've got a lot to share with you that's really kind of practical stuff going on the ground that hopefully you can go home and apply to your farm business as well. And we've got the resources and everything there, which I'll share at the end, that you can do that. So today's session, normally in the summer, apart from the last few years, we'd have been out and like showing you the trials and things on the ground, and so hopefully today we can bring that to life and share what's been going on ready, so you can see the results later in the year. So without further ado, we'll hand over to Brian to kick us off, and then we'll go through the presentations. If you've got questions as you go through the session, if you pop them in the box, I'll make sure they're answered as we get to the end. So I think without further ado, Brian, we'll hand over to you to hear how Harvest 2021 has gone for you so far, and yeah, what you've been up to on farm.
Brilliant, thank you, Teresa. Hello everyone. all over the parts of the country, and hopefully majority in the east. Hopefully the screen will move forward as I go along. So this is sort of just an update of what's been going on. But if we look back at what we had last year, the actual crop that we produced the previous year, so if the slide goes on to the next slide, we had predominantly low yields, but the market uplift has sort of helped, and it was probably one of the most cost-effective wheat crops that I've ever grown, just the way it worked out. It meant that lower biomass crops, it was easier to sort of cut back, and it was a very cheap year for disease. But with all that, it was a season to pull back on. But when you sort of look at it, we're thinking, don't be farming this year as last year. And that's something that was really mindful in my approach to this year. It's not just a, as I say, cut, paste and repeat. Every year is completely different. So what do we move into this year? So in the autumn, if the slide can just kick on, we took the decision to try some oilseed rape. We went with a companion cropping idea because it seemed to be a low risk approach to getting a crop away. And if the crop failed, it would then still be carried through as a break crop into the spring. So it was a sort of a easy shot to have a go at getting an oilseed rape crop away, but also having the comfort blanket that it could be used as an overwinter cover crop and then carried on into a spring break crop. So it seemed like an easy, low risk approach. We did some blackgrass management. Sort of, we had a nice flush after harvest. We did a little bit of shallow cultivations in the places that required it, and we did have a good flush, which was helpful. And also, this is the first year we tried a 10-week catch crop behind the combine. So we were establishing bursting clover, crimson clover, buckwheat, vetch, and linseed as a 10-week catch crop. Hopefully, in between a first and a second wheat. And it was the first time we tried it, and I was really quite impressed about how it ran. So as we moved into sort of the autumn sort of period, we were looking at obviously the BYDV concerns, and as I said, the cover crops. Just, it was amazing when I was driving around the countryside when we were allowed to go out of lockdown, driving around the countryside when a lot of my neighbours were ploughing up, pulling ground about. There's a lot of brown fields out there, but then when I got back to ours, where we had got a large proportion of overwinter cover crops and these catch crops, our farm just seemed so much greener and more alive. It was really quite interesting, sort of just observing that. And the observations were sort of a little bit more detailed because we actually recorded ivy bee, which is a new species for the farm, which is a late scavenging bee that has been moving up the country, and we found it actually foraging on the buckwheat. So it showed that these catch crops were giving a late source of pollen and nectar, which hopefully was boding well for our sort of integrated pest management and all the beneficials that we're trying to sort of get on the farm. So there was quite a lot going on, but it was really nice feel of having a really sort of green and flowering farm at that time of year when there was a lot of sort of barren plough fields and cultivated ground around us. So it was nice to see. Then we went into the sort of autumn planting. Early doors, it was dry, and we got a fair chunk of wheat in over one weekend with the two the direct drill and the strip till drill, and they went really well. We rolled up behind them. Then the conditions changed. It then got very wet, so the Old Faithful came out, and we were then sort of chipping away when conditions allowed with the combination drill. And then we actually had a demo of the Dale drill, which was a 6-meter Dale drill came in for demo, and it just gave us an added output of over the 4-meter direct drill. We were looking at the 4-meter direct drill to replace anyway, so this is why we're sort of doing different options. And we tried the Dale in the autumn, and then we tried some in the spring, which I'll talk about later. But the crops behind the Dale gone straight into direct into linseed stubbles and bean stubbles, and the wheat's come up really well behind it. So it was quite obvious that an extra 2 meters makes a big difference. So that's what sort of we're looking at in our sort of machinery cycling. So the establishment was better than last year. Last year we had a few issues which we had created in our own sort of way with too much cultivations, making too fine seed beds, which then got wet. So we left them a little bit more open where we were doing stale seed beds, which then allowed us to dry them out, and it was actually a better establishment. But we did find this year we had a very bad fruit fly damage behind 2 years after grass, which we haven't seen. And is that something that we're going to be sort of being a bit more wary of? But on the whole, we sort of learned from last year's mistakes, and the crops going into winter were much better. Aphid numbers, walking, we only found them in a couple of fields. Didn't feel there was enough. Didn't want to spray an insecticide and remove all the beneficials that we knew that we had. There's a lot of spiders, loads of spider webs, parasitic midges and wasps and everything else that was going on that sort of the NIAB team have been picking up. So we didn't actually apply an insecticide on any of our fields. And I've written there as no obvious BYDV, but when I was actually crop walking yesterday, we did find that actually the last field that we drilled, there is actually quite some patches of BYDV showing up now. So it's interesting that the last field is the only one that we actually got it in, which is you would sort of not expect, but it was just the way it went. So then coming into winter, we missed drilling into the 10-week catch crop, which is a shame because I really wanted to do it with a second week, but we had actually sprayed it off, and then the weather just didn't play ball, and the drills we tried the drills in them a couple of times, the direct drills, and they just left a slot and exposed seed. So I didn't really want to be sort of pushing it, so we just left it. They had been sprayed off, so then they just turned into a barren stubble for that period. But then I did have a trial field, which I left that same mix running all the way through winter alongside our actual multi-species cover crop, and so they were left as a cover crop, and they did quite well as a cover crop. And then we sort of experimented with rolling them, and then we sprayed them off early January, and then they've been direct drilled with spring beans or spring barley, and they've gone really well this year. Slugs were a problem. It actually turned out to be a wetter winter here than it was the year before, so slugs are always going to be a problem, especially behind the grass. And there was a lot of didn't do that too much baiting, but we had to monitor our thresholds and make sure that we weren't sort of just throwing the blue pellet about. We sort of got past that, the concern, the problems of losing crops, and then it sort of got colder as we went through. Continued with the field urine samples, just reaffirmed everything that we've seen over the previous years. Now we're into whatever the fourth winter of doing them, and yeah, nitrate levels behind the plough through the roof, behind the cover crops hardly any. The first initial one is the big sediment flush, and we found that the drains just flushed out a whole load of sediment in the first sort of heavy rain. Pesticide residues, thankfully, are very low. We haven't seen any sort of real problems apart from the occasional curb levels going up, which is good to see that we're not sort of seeing anything flushing out the bottom, which we shouldn't do. But again, the nitrate is the obvious story, which obviously we'll talk about later on. Then we come into the spring. Unusually dry early spring, and some nice weather allowed us to get some early N on. We went with a bigger dose of N early doors. Just after last year, we didn't get enough on earlier in what I thought. So we sort of changed our approach. Liquid was going around with, and then the prills were going around as well at the same time. So we sort of got a nice big early dose on, trying to build biomass because the crops were looking better. So we thought construction phase all the way through to April, build and stimulate growth. So that's what we did. April was very dry. The second dose of N sat around on the surface for a very long period of time, and then April was very, very cold. We had 14 sort of sub-zero morning temperatures, which didn't help the oilseed rape, didn't help wheat, just felt very cold, frost damage. We were very concerned about this dry period and the PGRs going on to stress crops, because we saw sort of stressed PGR sort of holding back last year, so we were sort of mindful of that. So we've sort of been playing the conundrums. Didn't do an early T0, and we just went with a sort of straight micronutrition biomass biostimulant to try and build biomass all the way into sort of end of April. We're trying to promote growth as much as possible whenever we felt the conditions were right. We had some nice sunny weather in April and March, which sort of got the start of the crop going, but these frosts kept on holding them back. So we're trying to sort of just feed them and keep them going. We've done a lot of nutrition and tissue analysis previously, and we sort of identified sort of zinc, copper, boron as the sort of micronutrient and magnesium. So they were feeding them. So poor old Nick on the sprays put quite a lot of bitter salts into the sprayer this year. So he's sort of done quite a few workouts early mornings. Then as we move through later into spring, we had, if the screen could just click on, yep. So we sort of had that sort of April slowed us down, and then we went into that very wet May. Well, I wouldn't say very wet for us. We only sort of had 55 mil, I think it was, roughly in May, where other parts of the country probably had double or triple that. But we had enough to really wet our clay soils up. So they've put the waters underneath them now, and now the crops are sort of benefiting from that. It went from rock hard, bone dry, cracking, all the way to what I call lush, growy weather, growy crops. T1 for me was a difficult choice because all the way up to T1, obviously we hadn't put a fungicide on. There was very little rain events. It was sort of very dry, very cold. So you're thinking there's not that much disease. And then when we came to actually apply T1, the forecast was obviously changing into May. And so it was the choice of how much do you invest? Do you go low and then catch your tail and sort of let the horse bolt, or do you go with a robust T1? And so there's a bit of a juggling act for T1, but we actually went with fairly robust T1 on the later drill because they had a longer time to T2, and then went sort of cut back at the early crops that we knew that were going to be coming into T2 much quicker. So that's the sort of approach that we took. Oilseed rate we pretty much left to it. Luckily got the whole crop away. Pigeons have been a problem. They've shot quite a few pigeons up and around the woods. One of the perils of having habitat on your farm is that pigeons seem to sort of come like magnets to the woodland, and the rate this year is all around the woods, which is one problem. But we just let it get on with it. Done very little disease control. Done some again some nutrition, biostimulants. Done some tissue analysis. And just sort of try to feed it and get it up and away. And yeah, I'm sort of taking a very low risk approach to it and low investment, and just said, well, just get on with it. And hopefully we'll get a good return because the price is going up. T2s have just been applied in the last sort of week, 10 days. And head over heart, crops look lush. Did some disease samples with the Bayer and Niab. They all came back with low, but again, my head, when you walk around the crop, there's a big biomass. All this moisture from May is being absorbed, nitrate, everything is that's fueling disease cycles. So we've gone with a fairly sort of sensible rate of Revastar at T2, pretty much. And then played around with the different things for the different trials, but it seems to be sort of a lush crop, very growy. And have we overspent, or was that the best investment we're going to make, considering there's some reports of some big disease sort of explosions going on around the country? So yeah, like all these things, we've got to be mindful that we don't want to be losing much yield on a decent crop at any time. So it's sort of pulling that. And then everything else that's been going on, we've done building repairs. We're doing a whole load of investment in the buildings for post BPS. I've got a house extension started, so just dealing with tradesmen and trying to find cement and materials has been fun and games for me. And we've also done a trial where we're trying to put spring beans in behind our herbage grass seed. So this was an interesting one. So the grass is absorbing and it's creating a high carbon source, and the beans, with being legume with a nitrogen sort of balance, should be benefiting from the legacy of the grass. So this is what the New Zealanders do after their herbage grass seed. So this is what we've been trying, and so we've been demoing different drills to see what we did. And they've come up really well, and they've kicked on. They're actually well in front of where the actual other beans that we put in around the farm behind the cover crop. So it does show that there's something there. Got a few bits of ryegrass coming in it, but hopefully we'll be able to tidy them up. But yeah, it's an interesting experiment, one that hopefully will mean that we won't have to plough the ground behind the grass, which is always something that we sort of reluctantly do. So hopefully that's something that we should take on for next year. And the other spring crop, spring barley, just been loved that May rain, and then now the heat of June. So now we're sort of really going great guns at the spring barley, and then we haven't got any linseed this year because our combine has fallen out of warranty. So I don't want to be running too much linseed through it. That's where the oilseed rape has replaced our linseed, but that's something that linseed might come back into the rotation again. And then going forward, with all that going on, we've then got all these trials, which hopefully the NIAB team will be sort of talking about. So if we just flick on to the last slide, we got obviously the nitrate loggers and soil sampling of the cover crops. Then we've been having fun and games drawing application maps for the high and low input investment for the trial with this lovely matrix of 100 meters by 30 meter plots, which going through the commercial sprayer. So that's starting to sort of show a few things. Hopefully, I'm sure when we were walking through it the other day, you could start making out different plots, but hopefully that will sort of show on the actual results that that Will and the team will hopefully find later on in the year. But at the moment, there's not much disease about, which is causing a little bit of problem when you try and do these things. And then the flowering strips that we put in last spring and autumn are just starting to flower. And they're starting to sort of draw attention to the general public, and people have been asking us questions, which is good. And off the back of that, we're then having the discussions about marginal land. So hopefully I've teed it up nicely for the team behind the scenes with NIAB to sort of go with all the stats about what's been going on with these trials. But it's been another exciting season, another different season, and every year is different, every season is different, and we're just trying to be mindful not to farm it as if it was last year. So that's pretty much all from me.
Brilliant, thank you, Brian. A fascinating run through as ever of what's been going on, and great to have the background and the details there. I'm just going to ask a quick question. Trevor's just asked you, when was that BYDB affected crop drilled again? I think you said, was it last when it was?
I think it was early November.
Okay.
I think off the top of my head. I'll look it up, and if I can't find it, then my record keeping isn't good as it should be.
Well, we'll get back to you, Trevor, in the question and answer session. Brilliant. Thank you, Brian, and that's a great segue, isn't it, Will, into what you and the team are going to talk us through. So we'll now run through each of our trials, and Will's up first, talking about our managed lower inputs trials, so looking at the fungicides and varieties linked to tea timing. So over to you, Will, to talk us through that. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Teresa. So good morning. So if we could click onto the next slide. What I really want to do was just to sort of refresh everyone's minds, if you've been following this over the last few years, but what we're trying to achieve with this trial. So there's 2 input levels based on sort of disease that we're observing, the weather, as sort of as Brian's already alluded to, and other predictive tools where they're sort of becoming a bit more available and more accessible to the wider industry. And then within those, we've then got every single application from T1 through to T3, both individually, but also as every single one of the possible combinations, so T1 and T2 together, T2, etc. And this will really allow us at the end of the year to pick out exactly the contribution of each individual timing and also how they work with each other, so we can get sort of a relative input that they're contributing to both the disease level, but more importantly the yield, and therefore the economic output of the crop. So this was winter wheat drilled variety Gleam, drilled sort of back end of middle to back end of October. So if we could flick through, and then the T1 went on the 7th of May, and these were the choices made for both the low and the high input. So you've got Firefly, so just a single fungicide product, 2 actives, combined with a little bit of growth regulator and boron, as again Brian was saying, they're picking up some of these deficiencies within the crop. And then high, the choice was to go a little bit stronger with the chemistry, a little bit more robust with Bugle, and then a top up of tebuconazole. a little bit extra PGR, and a little bit more boron. And then if we flick through again, we've got the T2 application, which went on beginning of this week. And again, so the real high rate of Revestar, 1.5 full label rate for the high, supported with a little bit of this yield on, which is a seaweed-based biostimulant. And then compared to the low, which had the close to just over half rate Revestar. So it'll be really interesting to see how those are really comparing. I think generally the high is reflective of what Brian has done across the farm and in the rest of the field. And then the low is sort of what could I have had? How could I have cut back? Where could I have cut back? So it'll be interesting to compare these as we go through the season. But at the moment, so next slide, please. Oh yeah, sorry. So weather. Well, I just wanted to put a little bit of context. I think we all have a rough idea of what the weather's been doing. We had I suppose a fairly normal. So on the left-hand side, the blue bars are the actual weather at Brian's, and the red line is the sort of fairly local, long-term 30-year average. So the early autumn, September, October was fairly spot on, and actually November was fairly dry relative, and then it all got very, very wet over December and into January. And then we moved into this sort of dry early spring, very dry April, incredibly dry, and then back up as Brian said, sort of 55 mil or so, just under of rain in May, which is really started to drive things, get things going. And so far in June, we're still on zero. Although I think might have had a little bit last night, depending on where we were in the country. And then the temperatures, sort of fairly similar pattern. I think generally on the low side of normal, February, March, April. Say April just dropping there. That's where we sort of had some of these overnight frosts that really held the crop back a little bit in places. And it's only really been the last week or so that these temperatures have really started to rise. So if we go on to the next slide, we've just got a little bit of context around the weather at the T1 application, and this is where these are really what's driving the decision making. So on the rainfall, there was a little bit of rain beforehand after that prolonged period of dry, but it was very much a case of little and often, very regular, almost every day, topping up, just gradually topping up into the crop. The leaves were staying wet predominantly for long periods of time, so humidity was beginning to build, particularly after T1 as these temperatures began to rise, and say a really dramatic sort of almost just over a couple of days, really big swing from an average temperature, daytime temperature of 5 degrees all the way up to about 15, and where it's sort of where it's dropped again, but now it's back up around that sort of much higher level, which is where the T2s come on. So if we then move on, we'll have a look at actually what we're seeing in the crop, which is still overall very little. We're monitoring the disease every 2 weeks, so we're going out around the key application timings, but also within them to see how they are affecting the crop. And generally, the levels are really slowly building through the crop. Around T1, it was sort of 10, 15, 20% sectorial on leaf 6. And as leaf 6 is really senesced away, we've now got this disease moving on to leaf 5, and we're sort of at a trial average of 8%, but it's all very, very even. There's no differences within any of the plots or any of the treatments. So still really, really very low. Having said that, we are sort of beginning to pick up sputterings of yellow rust, particularly coming onto leaf 2 and 3 landing, and a few foci are developing in the field, although at this point obviously nothing significant. But as I said, the rainfall and temperature type data is beginning to put us really into that range where yellow rust is going to take hold if we're not treating it. So we're expecting to really see some disease begin to develop in the crop over the next couple of weeks, which will really test those T2 applications. It seems that at the moment maybe the T1 low was enough, and if not a little bit lower, but ultimately it also depends on the final yield of the crop, and there's obviously benefits to some of these products that are not just about disease, which will be interesting to pick up later in the season. So if we say overall, we've not really got a great deal to talk about because there's so little disease yet again. But I think that as Brian said, that is very similar to last year currently. but we need to be looking ahead, and this is why we're sort of repeating this type of work. And it feeds into, or feeds from some of the other work that NIBE's doing on the Morley Lots trial, where over since late 1980s we've been looking at this similar sort of trial design. So it'll be interesting to see how at the end of the season how this fits into the long-term type data set. And if we then next slide. So yeah, so this is just some photos now of just some of the untreated plots. So oh, sorry, Kristen, can we just go back? Oh no, sorry, that's right, 19. Yes, sorry. Yeah, so 19. So this was T1 application. It's a very, very clean all the way down, and where you'll just begin to see the brown, that's sort of the leaf 5, leaf 6 point. And then if we click through again, this was earlier this week and a little bit of a sunny photo, but crops really getting going now, really lush. Beginning to see ears just poking out the top of some of these crops. So really motoring along, lots of big green luscious biomass for some disease to get its teeth stuck into. So if we click through again, the other thing we've been doing is just monitoring the crop using a handheld NDVI scanner and a visual GAI type assessment. And part of that is just to see how the two compare. Something like an NDVI scanner is not typically available on farm, but being able to judge your crops with a visual GAI score throughout the season is a really useful benchmarking tool. So I've just got the NDVI data up here. I think it just shows a little bit more of the variation. I think it's a little bit of it's a much higher granularity in terms of, also much higher granularity in terms of the actual range it's picking up. I think that the GAI score, you do tend to sort of round everything up or down into a, it's a 0.1, 0.2 type scale, whereas this is a much finer scale. So you can see that there's the black diamonds, and these are the actual site means. So we're really tracking the growth through from November. It was quite low, and then it's its fastest growing point. So despite those sort of colder temperatures, is still between growth stage 30 and growth stage 31. And then at those earlier timings, we did sort of pick up this sort of natural variation between the plots. So at this point, nothing was different between any of the plots. All be drilled the same date, all the same fertilizer. So there is this obvious natural variation within the field. But by the time you get to sort of growth stage 31, growth stage 33, that's really closed up, where plants have compensated additional tillers, put on greater growth where necessary to really fill out that canopy. And then we're at the latest timings, again, this is around the T2 just early this week, just beginning to see that drop back down again, which again, no differences across the plots, but obviously it's just beginning to, as things like the ears come out, they're a little bit lighter green. Whereas this NDVI, that's basically is picking up the green, so the darker green, the crop, the higher the number. So as these ears come out, they begin to reduce that number. But there seems to be a bit of variation picking up already. So it'll be interesting to track this one through the season, which we're going to take all the way through to harvest. So we'll pick up the senescence and see whether any of these plots, as a result of the products used, are holding onto their green area for longer than compared to others. At the moment, there seems to be a bit divergent, so that might be the way it's going. So it'll be interesting to pick that up again in another couple of weeks. And really, it's all about the future now. So again, if we just click through, as I said, we're going to continue to monitor disease, and I think really this is where it's going to really get interesting as we're beginning to see those bits of yellow rust coming to the top of the canopy and the septura moving up from the bottom. We're going to yield the plots, obviously, and begin to work out sort of this economic returns for each treatment. Obviously, there's the very different cost level, and that will also begin to feed off the sample analysis and try and break it down if some of these are producing better quality grain that's more saleable or might dictate a slightly higher price on the market. So yeah, so really exciting. I say very little to show so far, but I think it's all going to be in the next couple of months when we have an autumn roundup. There'll be some really exciting things to see. So thank you.
Perfect, thank you, Will. It's always a funny one, isn't it? As an industry, we don't really want to see disease and we want to keep our spend low and keep the crops clean. And actually, as a trials manager, a bit of disease makes it more interesting. So, yeah, it'd be really interesting to see. But I think what you've presented reflects what's going on around the country. And actually, even in a low disease pressure year, as we've had for the last couple of years, these kind of things are really important to look at and discuss, aren't they? So, yeah, we'll see how we go through the season. Or the rest of the season. Go on, Brian.
Just the rest of the farm had the low dose of Revastar, not the full rate.
That's fine. Yeah, no, fair enough.
No, majority of the farm had 0.8, and then we played around with different ones here and there. But yeah, no. So I haven't done full rate across the farm. No.
No, fair enough.
You know, quite getting pounded by people on Twitter. So I'll go.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you so much, Will. That's brilliant. And we'll ask some questions in a bit. Thank you. Great. So now we're going to hand over to Nathan, and Nathan's going to talk us through what we've been doing on the cover crops and water quality updates. So over to you, Nathan.
Okay, thank you, Teresa, and good morning, everybody. And yes, as Teresa just mentioned, I just want to give a bit of an update on the cover crop work that's been going on, and obviously now in the 4th year, it's starting to really show some of the sort of differences that we might or might not have expected from using cover crops. So just as a bit of a background, our objective really is to determine the role of cover crops in reducing nitrate leaching, and obviously look at the impact on crop performance, but really focusing across the rotation. You know, there's been quite a few studies looking at the impacts on the following crops, you know, the growth of the actual cover crop and what it can do, but less so rotationally. And in my opinion, that's the important thing really with cover crops. They need to be seen as a rotational element to your cropping systems. Again, both work at the strategic farm has shown the benefits of growing cover crops in terms of nitrate reduction and losses to water. And other studies have also proven that as well. So growing cover crops to mitigate against losses to water, and you know, obviously improving water quality is certainly something of very beneficial. However, the availability of when nitrogen that's been captured by that cover crop then becomes available is something that's a bit more complex and more difficult to determine. But obviously in this study, we were able to monitor it through the following crops, which is really interesting. So basically we have a split field design with 2 fields, both sandy loams, and each field basically has a treatment. So we have a plough treatment with a cover crop, and then we have just an overwintered plough, and then the other field has a stubble with a cover crop, and then a stubble, and then from that the spring barley was grown last year, which was undersown to a forage grass, and now we're monitoring that through the grass season. So we've been monitoring soil mineral nitrogen supply and the biomass in the crop, looking at nitrates in the water, and obviously looking at various soil assessments, including soil penetrometer, bulk densities, a visual evaluation of soil structure as well, and a bit of an indication on earthworm populations as well, to try and determine, you know, what other benefits the cover crops in the long term are having. So next slide, please. So just some data from earlier on in the season. When we went out in the autumn, in about November, we wanted to sort of capture the amount of nitrogen that was both in the crop but also in the soil, and from that we could start to understand, you know, where that nitrogen was being taken up, or where it was potentially, if it was in the soil, liable to leaching, particularly over winter when we expect higher levels of rainfall. So the first top graph shows the results of the nitrogen concentration in both the biomass and in the soil. So the dark blue is the soil mineral nitrogen. This was taken to 90 centimeters depth, and as you can see, in 3 of the 4 treatments, the range was around about 30, maybe 40 kilos of nitrogen, with the one exception being the cover crop with a 1-pass system, where that soil mineral nitrogen was actually about double, it was around 80 kilos. And then the biomass and the nitrogen biomass from the herbage grass at that stage was anywhere between about 15 to 45 kilos of N. And as you can see, the cover crop one pass system appeared to, it basically had a lower biomass, and although the N content was similar to the other treatments, obviously with the actual lower biomass weight, there was less nitrogen in the crop, and therefore more, I think, was in the soil, which potentially is a risk, obviously, to as I say, over winter leaching. When we actually looked at the nitrate water, we can see there this is the bottom chart, that the levels were generally in 3 of the 4 treatments were at or below the EC drinking water levels of 50 milligrams of nitrate. But again, you can see there quite clearly that the cover crop one pass system over the whole winter period significantly had more nitrate getting into the water and was exceeding the EC level. So this is something we need to look into a bit more detail to try and understand why that's occurring. It might just be down to basically a sort of conditions at the time with that herbage grass not getting away in the autumn quite so readily as other treatments, or it might actually be more of a historic type effect from the previous crop and how much nitrogen was able to be sort of captured in the previous crop and how much more may have been left after the crop, which obviously the herbage grass could or may not have been able to utilise. So going forward, we will continue to look at the nitrogen at harvest in both the herbage grass and in the soil. So we've sort of got a full spectrum of nitrogen measures through the season. And we're also looking at soil structure assessments. Again, that might help just to define a bit if there was poorer soil structure within that treatment with the one pass system that may have restricted root growth of that herbage grass, which again might lead to the lack of nitrogen uptake. But time will see. But it's really interesting, as I say, to have the ability to look across the rotation, and obviously now in year 4 we can start to see how those cover crops can be sort of beneficial in a wider rotation context rather than in a single season. So that was more I needed to say, so thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you, Nathan. It is fascinating, and I was on farm yesterday and we were having the same discussions about how do these cover crops, what's the impact as you go down the rotation, and I think, and Emily will talk it through, but it's possibly even that 3rd crop on again, isn't it? And so it's fascinating to start to pull some of these kind of figures out, and yeah, like you say, follow it through to yield and beyond harvest as well. So thank you, lots of really interesting information in there, and so good to be able to pull the crop, the soil, the water kind of all together, and to bring that together with the costs and everything as well. So thank you for that. I'm sure there'll be questions when we get to that stage in a minute. So now over to you, Aoife, and Aoife's going to talk us through the work on the floral margins, or some of the work that's happened, Aoife, isn't it, and some of it that's all about to come as well as we come into the assessments coming into June. So over to you.
Cool. So can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so floral margins are a pretty pertinent topic at the moment. It's National Hedgerow Week. Lots of farmers will have land in stewardship, and pretty soon we're all going to be grappling with the new elm scheme. So the question we're trying to answer at Brian's farm is, can flowering strips, either placed around the field margins or within the field, be an answer to pest management now, but also in the future? Because these are long-term studies. They're not something that you get instantaneous results from. So we're looking at these over a 5-year period. Some of the common questions we get asked about floral margins are, what are the best flowering grass species to grow for different natural enemies of your pests? Where should you put the flowering strips in the landscape? How should I look for pests and beneficials in the margin or in the crop? How do I get started? Where do I begin? And what can I try or do on my farm right now, this moment, today? So these are some of the questions we're trying to answer at Brian's farm at Strategic Farm East. Next slide, please. So at Brian's farm, we have 3 fields we're looking at. So the top one here, the farm standard, there is no floral margin on the outside. We have one field where we have floral margin all around the outside, so the field edge strips on the left. And then the bottom field is where we have the margin on the outside, plus also a center strip going through the crop. And these pictures are kind of what the floral margins look like at different times of the year. So the first picture on the left is one of the outside floral margins last October. You can see there's a little bit of flowering happening there, but it's pretty well established. And then the one on the right is a picture that Brian took yesterday. And this margin was sown last May or June, I think. And you can see that within a year, it's looking really lush and beautiful, and there's already flowers starting to appear. So next slide, please. What are the flower and grass species in the mix? So if you're a keen botanist, you will notice that all these flowers here are perennials. And this is something that we're really interested in, because if you're sowing a mix, one of the things that we're concerned about is, do the plants in the margins encroach into the crop and cause a weed problem? Now, you wouldn't expect this with perennial species, because they just don't move. Well, they should move into the crop, but we are going to investigate that. So we'll be doing assessments within the crop for movement of these plants into the main crop. We'll also be doing establishment as well, so to look at different, because when you're drilling these margins, some of them the seeds are heavier than others, so we want to look at, is there even establishment of all these different floral species throughout the margin itself. Next slide, please. So this is a big slide. So these are our 3 fields and where we've put our traps. So bottom 59, big guinea row, and top 59. If we look at bottom 59 first, so what we've done is we've taken 2 sides of the field. And you can see the pink dots here. So we've taken 3 points in the field. We've laid a 100-meter transect, and we've placed our traps at 3 points in that margin. So the traps are placed 25 meters apart. We've then gone 100 meters into the field and done the exact same thing. So and we've GPSed these points also so that we go back to the same points in the field every time. And we've done that across the 3 fields. So you can see the pink dots, the green dots in the top right, and then the kind of white dots here on the bottom left. So the same points across each of the 3 fields, 1 meter from the margin edge, and then 100 meters into the margin edge. And the traps are placed 25 meters apart throughout the field. With the center margins, that's bottom 59, the top left, we've placed the traps at 1 meter from the margin, and then we also have that point kind of 100 meters in as well. So I think in total we've got 39 assessment points that we're looking at, and again we've GPSed those points that we know we're going back to the same point throughout the season, so that the points are repeatable and we can kind of assess them the whole way through the year. So therefore, those trapping points are for the insects, and we'll come on to those traps later. We're also doing weed and floral assessments. So we'll do a similar thing where we will pick a 100-meter transect within the margin, and we'll lay down a quadrat. So we have these kind of vertical quadrats here that we've laid down, and we'll do an establishment method, or we'll do establishment of the flower margins within those quadrats, and those quadrats will be placed every 25 meters throughout that transect. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is about the methods that we're using for the monitoring. So the monitoring takes place the whole way throughout the season. So we started last autumn. We did our first set of monitoring last October, and we started with slug and pitfall trapping. And to do that, our slug traps here, you can see on the left here. So these were just basically a plant plot saucer with some chicken layers mash laid underneath. You can also just use a bit of alpin or a bit of muesli. and we just put a rock over the top just to keep them in place, because there was quite a lot of wind at the time. And we came back and checked those 3 days later, and you can see that we picked up quite a lot of slugs on this field in particular. In the same place as the slug trap, about a foot upwards from it, we also placed the pitfall traps. And the pitfall traps are there to collect ground-based predators and insects. And all these were basically was a yogurt pot, like an onken pot, or just any kind of food pot, dug into the ground with either, you can put a bit of mesh over it as well if you want to keep kind of more larger mammals out of the traps. And we left these in the field for 3 days, went back to pick them up later. You could leave them for 5 days if you want, but for the purposes of consistency across all the sites, we went for 3 days with these. And then we picked them out and identified the insects 3 days later. So moving into spring and summer, we'll also be using those pitfall traps or food pots. We'll also be putting those back into the fields, but then we'll also be using more aerial, kind of off the ground water traps. And you can see these here in the spring, summer. So these are just kind of clear, so like sweet tubs that you get. And we're finding ways at the moment to try and keep those off the ground. So one of the problems you encounter when you're trying to install these traps is that they get knocked over by munkjack or deer or other methods. So we're kind of figuring out ways at the moment to try and keep those in place while also keeping them off the ground. So these are just some pictures that Mark Ramsden at AHDB took, and we've just basically drilled a hole through the pot and installed a flat-headed, like a tent peg through them, and that'll raise the trap off the ground. So we're hoping that will work, because these traps have to stay in the field for a minimum of 3 to 5 days, and if they get knocked over, you lose your data. So it's kind of important to figure out how we're gonna keep them off the ground. We're also doing aphid bait cards. So these are just basically dry stick traps that you can buy from Coppert or Ecos, with a bit of sand over them. And what we're doing is we'll take aphids, live aphids, grain aphids, stick them onto the card, and the idea is that the natural enemies go, "Ooh, look, there's live aphids sitting on this." We'll come onto the traps, and it's a way of monitoring for beneficial insects. And we're having a go with this season as well. It's our first year doing these observations. And then we'll also be doing aphid counts, so looking at the ears and looking at the tillers to look for aphids, as well as aphid mummies, looking for parasitized aphids. So lots going on in spring, summer. So the pitfall traps, the aerial-based water traps to look for flying natural enemies and insects, the bait traps, so a different method for kind of for monitoring the aerial-based natural enemies, as well as the aphid and parasitoids aphid counts as well. We're also doing solitary bee monitoring. So these are, we installed these back in March, and these are looking for solitary bees, so mason bees. And we've installed these 2 traps on the 3 fields that we're monitoring from. So we've installed them 1 on each side of the field. So we've got 6 traps in total across the 3 fields. And you can buy these mason bee kits. I'm sure Teresa or Emily will be able to point anyone interested in these to where you can buy the kits later. But these specific traps, we bought the inner tubes, and we made the rest of the trap ourselves. So these are just basically drain pipe cut to a specific length, with a kind of a bung at the end taped to it, and then we installed the post into the field. We drilled in, it's just a drain pipe holder that we drilled into the post, and then installed the trap. The front of the trap, so where you can see the tubes themselves, that's facing towards the sun, so you want it facing south or southeast, and the traps will stay in place from March until August. Around August time, then we will take the inner tubes out, and we'll look for bee casings or anything else that's contained in it. And we might not just be bees, we might be looking for other insects as well. So they're very, very easy to install once you get the inner tubes from mason bees. And it's something that we just did with stuff that was lying around the farm or bits that you can get from home base for very, very cheap. And that goes for all the methods that we're using at the Barker's farm. So the pitfall traps, the slug traps, the water traps, all stuff that you can get very, very easily and make yourself. And that's the whole point of, well, one of the points of this work is to be able to get out there and start doing monitoring for natural enemies and beneficial insects yourself. So next slide, please. The common species that we are finding, so we started with the monitoring last October, and we've done 3 assessment points so far. So we did our monitoring in kind of September, October. We did another monitoring kind of January time, and then again in March. And these are the kind of species that we found. So kind of all year round, we've been picking up from kind of October to March, we were picking up kind of common, larger predators. So your ground beetles, your spiders, different species of fly, as well as smaller insects, so wasps and midges, and then very, very small things you can only identify with a hand lens, like springtails. So these are present in the traps all year round, and we were picking these up with our pitfall traps, or ground-based pitfall traps. And then as we move into spring and summer, so we'll start doing our aerial trapping from next week onwards, and we'll be looking for, as I said earlier, our aphid species, our aphid mummies, so our parasitoid aphids, as well as fairly common predators like hoverfly, lacewing, ladybirds. And we'll be looking at the different life stages, so whether they're in the pupae or the larvae stage, because depending on the life stage of the insect, they tend to be more voracious. So we know that hoverfly larvae, lacewing larvae, ladybird larvae, they're quite voracious predators, and they will eat whatever is kind of in front of them. So we'll be looking at not just the all year round predators and parasitoids, but also looking for these kind of more seasonal insect species as well in the aerial traps. And one of the things we're interested in as well is not just the identification, so what do you have, but also how do you interpret it? So it's all well and good to kind of find beetles at a certain point in the field, or maybe you find some hoverfly larvae, but what does that mean? So what does that mean in the context of your farm? You need to think about the previous crop, what's in your floral margin at that time, and what's going on in the crop itself, and is it having effect on the aphid pressure or other pest pressure in the field at that time. So identification is very important, but also so is the interpretation, and it's something we'll cover in future webinars that both ADAS and SRUC are involved in. Okay, so final slide. Yeah, so I think the main thing to think about here is that it's all about the results, but it's also about the methodologies, and it's all about taking things from this trial and trying them out on farm yourself. So trying out pitfall trapping, trying out water trapping, and just getting to grips with getting started on this, trying out bee trapping. So the take-home message really is, what can you go out and do on your farm today?
Perfect, thank you, Aoife. And that's very much what the strategic farm is all about, isn't it? Taking the research, putting it into practice on a commercial farm, and then hopefully we've inspired a few out there to go and try an aphid bait card, or have a look at a water trap, make your own solitary bee nest and see what you find, and then you can link that back to what Aoife and the team are finding on the strategic farm. So thank you very much, Aoife. So we're just going to now move on to look at some marginal land work that David's been doing. A really interesting piece of work and analysis, taking us forward to get us ready for the changes that's happening over the next few years. So over to you, David, for doing that.
Thank you, Teresa. I'll be brief. I know we're running out of time. So yes, we've been looking at how to identify marginal land at Brian's farm. Next slide, please. And this has all come about from the Environmental Land Management Scheme coming into force over the next few years. We've obviously got the Sustainable Farming Initiative coming in 2022, and then the Local Nature Recovery and the Landscape Recovery coming in 2024. And you can see a couple of taglines from the policy paper produced in March. Sort of the general idea, though, is that it's likely that all of these initiatives will require areas currently in production to be converted either both into short-term schemes such as the flowering strips that Eve has just covered, or potentially longer-term schemes such as wooded areas or long-term grass. And the idea at Brian's farm is, where do we best identify the places to put these? And the idea from an economic agricultural point of view is that it's the areas that are least profitable to arable production. Next slide, please. So how do we identify this? Well, we need to think at a much finer scale than conventional ways of looking at margins, whether at the farm, across a crop, or just at a specific field. We need to look at subfield. Unfortunately, Brian has got the data to do this. So we need yield mapping. Brian's got yield maps dating back to 2010 all the way through to 2020 on a well-calibrated combine and well-recorded data. We also need season-specific fixed costs. So this is field level if it's variable, for example, rented land. So we need to have every single year has a fixed cost associated to each field. We also need season-specific field level variable costs coming from gatekeeper or muddy boots, but then also subfield if you're using technology such as variable rate fertilizers. Brian doesn't currently use variable rate fertilizers, but he does adjust inputs based on that field's needs, as he discussed earlier. So we do need individual field inputs, not just across the crop. And that allows us to calculate a net margin for each yield map data point. And this is based off variable cost plus fixed cost minus the yield times grain price. Next slide, please. So as you can see, this is just an example of one field of data that Brian has given us. So this is 10 or 8 yield maps across the rotation. Now, you need the yield mapping across the rotation, but it's also important to recognise there's likely to be missing years. In this case, there was an oilseed rape crop in 2013 that was a trial, I believe. And then also there might be crops that aren't very well spatially mapped. So in Brian's case, it's the herbage grass seed. Although it does go through the combine, the yield maps tend to be just more of a proxy of moisture content, not yield, which has such a large effect on the herbage grass. So we have to discard them, and it's important to recognise that missing data when you're trying to contextualise the findings. The data must be accurate reflection of yield, and Brian, fortunately, with having weigh cells on his trailers, has a recorded yield mean for each field based on the total grain produced, and that allows us to compare against the yield map data to ensure that what we're recording spatially matches what we have actually recorded in the shed. And you can see there from just that A/B plot that obviously down the bottom there's the herbage grass, so we ignore them, but generally the winter wheat follows a good trend compared to what's recorded, and we can put some adjustment corrections onto that data if it's slightly high as it was in one of those years. Next slide, please. So the next part of the process, we also clean those yield maps. They go through quite a reasonable cleaning process to identify areas that are either very significantly different from the points around it, or the combine's been turning a lot previously, or the excessive or insufficient speed. But the idea is we want to identify patterns in this yield map data. So this has been developed through a number of AHDB projects and including in the literature. And one thing that's come out of this is using clustering methods. So a very brief example of a clustering method on an example data set to your right there is that we try and identify areas of the field that perform the same in all years. So if you look at the circled red dots, then if we assume each one of them is the same point in the field in 2011 and 2013, it's very high in 2013, but sort of an average yield in 2011. The orange dots are low yielding in both years, and the blue dots fluctuate from a high yielding 2011 to low yielding in 2013. So once we apply this clustering method across the next slide, please. Yeah, so we can then apply this clustering method to all the yield data we have, and it identifies patterns in the data set. And you can see here from that example, it's identified a cluster down the left, or the west side of the field with that blue strip, and that it dots around on some of the headlands elsewhere. A green cluster in the middle of the field, and then also some headland clusters, but then also as that little tail of the field goes off, that forms. So what can we do with that data? Next slide, please. So this allows us to compare long-term performance for each cluster. So you can see in the top graph is the yield performance for that cluster. Now I know from Google Earth and speaking to Brian that west side of the field faces a wood. So what we're seeing there is probably some shading, some rabbits and pigeon encroaching, as he discussed, onto that sort of first 20 meters of the field. And generally, with the exception of 2011, a dry year, potentially some reduction in evapotranspiration has helped it in that year. But generally, it's a much poorer part of the field, and therefore is an area that's probably most suitable to be taken out, put into an environmental scheme, which Brian has actually done in the last couple of years. But not only can we identify it's generally poor, we can use the margin data to calculate how much it's actually costing Brian to take that area of the field out of production. And you can see it teeters around the £400 a hectare mark. Now, I'm not sure the complete area of that area at the moment, but that gives us Brian the idea of how much money he needs to retain from the scheme to maintain a profitable business. Moving on, if you want to take further area of the field, obviously you could identify that cluster down the bottom corner. Again, not quite as poor performing as the blue cluster, but certainly not less profitable than the green cluster in the middle of the field. Next slide, please. So this is just the first steps of what we're doing is cleaning, processing and clustering the data. We're now going to look at identifying clusters across the farm with the lowest economic performance and comparing these so we can see how much of the farm is marginal and what sort of schemes we could employ on them. Also want to consider cluster performance across the rotation. So does a cluster perform better in a spring crop or a winter crop? And this is particularly important when we think about schemes such as ethers, flowering strips that may just be put in for 8 to 12 months. And we may change where those schemes go depending on the crop grow. We also want to look at these, identify areas of both low economic importance and in high environmental risk. So one tool we've got to do this is the SciMap runoff risk. So that's just an overview of the farm there. So the idea is actually if we can take the low economic performing parts of the farm that also coincide with potential areas of high environmental risk, we get a win-win situation. So that'll be going over in the next couple of months, and hopefully we can report back in November how we find it. But also there's some workshops at the end of the month that will discuss how we can go about deploying these methods on your farm. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you, David. It's such a fascinating piece of work that you've done there, and really interesting to kind of pull it all of this data together and really make it work for us on farm. Like David says, we've got a workshop coming up on marginal land on the 25th of June, and we've got 2 levels of it, haven't we, Dave? We've got a foundation one for those of you that might not be yield mapping yet, but want to go through this similar kind of thought process, and then we've got an advanced session for those of you that have got the yield mapping, you know, have got an idea of your costs and things and how you can bring that together. So we'll share the details of that in a minute, but yeah, that will be to kind of discuss all of this in a lot more detail. Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody. If I can bring all of our speakers back now, we've got a couple of minutes for discussion and any questions you've got. If you've got any questions, if you'd like to pop them in the questions box, I can then ask our panel of speakers to answer those for you. So I'll just kick off with one quick one round the table. In terms of kind of thinking about, all of you are kind of doing things on your core research, and then Brian's putting them into practice on his farm. If there's something that a farmer or an advisor listening could take away and put into practice on farms that they manage or farms their clients are working with, what would that be, do you think? We'll start with you, Nathan.
So I think in terms of cover crops, we need to recognise their validity within rotation and the importance of them, and use them as a tool. But obviously, like all these things, they have a cost associated with them. So it's important to look at them, in terms of the financial value, to manage their costs in terms of the seed and the establishment costs, to look at the return you get. And then also, as I say, consider at the moment it's difficult sometimes to put a financial value on some of the intrinsic values they bring, e.g. nitrate reduction. And that's where I know water companies are assisting growers with those costs to help with that, because and hopefully the new ELM scheme may well support growers in that way as well.
Definitely. Brilliant. Thank you, Nathan. Will, thoughts from you?
Sorry, you're going to have to repeat the question. That seems such a long time. Sorry, yeah. Repeat the question, please, Teresa.
Is there something from what you've been doing on farm within your trial that farmers at home or advisors with their clients could do to kind of put that into practice on farm?
I think it is a case of understanding where you sit sort of on the level of risk. We've got like a low and a high, and in any given year, I mean, you don't know what's going to happen, so you need to be able to be prepared to protect yourself for what is coming up. But I think it's about fitting yourself where you are on that sort of risk level. Are you prepared to be a little bit braver, go a little bit lower, but be prepared that actually disease might come in and you might end up in a firefighting situation, which sometimes the products aren't going to be able to get you out of? Or do you want to be far more robust from the start, and hopefully not have to deal with anything as it comes around? And it's probably thinking about where you are, where you want to be on that spectrum.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and then you can link your varieties to that, can't you, and link your programs and think about it. No, it's really interesting, Will, thank you. David, I guess ours is going to be covered in the workshop, a bit more detail, so everybody's got to come along to that. Anything from your point of view now?
You're on mute, David.
Just mute himself to talk. On a broader level, the recording, not just data, but recording what's going on farm. Brian does a good job of that, recording that actually that was drilled late and that had some BYDV in it, or this is a new species we've not found on farm, or this part of the farm was attacked by hares in this year. That sort of data over time builds up a nice picture of what's going on, and could potentially be useful when making decisions in the future, as we're now looking at Brian's clusters, and Brian can easily say, oh yes, that was a bit of black grass in 2012 that I sprayed out, or that patch there was badly attacked by rabbits. So, even just little anecdotal bits of data can add a lot of context to some of the figures, and then also what Aoife and Nathan and Will are trying to do in terms of recording what's making your decision making and what's going on farm is really useful data to have.
Great, and I think when you come to put all the data sets together like you've done, kind of having that record and having that record keeping is invaluable, isn't it? Brilliant, thank you, David. Aoife?
Yeah, I mean, there's loads of things you could do right now. And one of the things that we kind of hear a lot about from people who are trying this for the first time is just the volume, the time it takes to get going. And some farmers have kind of said, God, you need someone to literally be out doing this almost as a full-time job, out monitoring for insects and birds. And at the Barkers, they're very lucky to also have Patrick, who's a keen naturalist, so he does a lot of this as well. But in terms of where to get started, just if you've got soup pots or sweet pots lying around, wash them out and just get them into your field and put some water in and just have a go. It's not about being right, it's just about getting started and getting out there and having a look. You can get out and start looking for larger predators, so things like beetles, and start getting your eye in and looking for different colors, different shapes, and different species. But yeah, the first thing is just to get out there and start having a look. Take your hand lens and get out. Look at your ears. Look at your crop, and have a look. See what's out there.
Brilliant, thank you, Aoife. Yeah, lots happening, and like you say, once we get started, the interest levels grow, don't they, of what you found and what that means. And yeah, no, it's great. Brian, I know there's loads that you've learned already from kind of being part of the strategic farm project that you're kind of developing and putting into practice on your own farm business. Is there something that you found most interesting from the last few years, or something that you think would be adding the most value?
I would say just being brave. I think it's just given me the confidence to go and try stuff, even if it doesn't look like it's done anything now and you've learned from mistakes or something like that. It's all I would say is, anyone out there, just try this stuff, try some cover crops, try some flowering margins. It's amazing what emotions things will drag up, and you'll then get an interest in it, and it'll go further. Be brave with your fungicide choice. I've got a feel which is how low I can go for the second year, and that's off the back of the work that we did last year and what we're doing this year with Will. So just try it and just be brave, and then talk about it. Talk it with your peers, talk it with your neighbours, talk about it on Twitter, and just be honest with how you feel about it, because that's where it comes down to the evaluating of risk. And that's where farming is all risk management, and how it actually sits in your gut and sort of business is where you want to be. But all I can say is try it, talk about it, come to these meetings, come to these webinars, and hopefully we'll see you all in person on farm soon.
Brilliant, thank you, Brian. And I think as we move into the kind of, you know, integrated pest management and sustainable kind of farming practices, they're not very easy, are they? And they're very different depending on the farm you are, where you are in the country, what soil type you've got. And so the shared learning and discussion of what we're all doing, we're all asking similar questions, just trying to make it work for our businesses. So yeah, hopefully this is a good forum for doing that. Brilliant. Right, thank you everybody. That's been a fascinating discussion. Great to hear what's going on. Great to bring it all to life in this way. And I know lots still to happen in terms of what June might bring and harvest, and then what the results look like. So we'll follow that with interest. I've put a couple of links in the chat for anybody that wants to kind of look at that again and look at the details. And Brian and Emily have made some fantastic videos with a discussion in there as well. So I think just to round up this morning, Emily, you're just going to talk us through what's happening going forward, and then just a bit of interest of what's happening around the rest of our network as well. So we'll hand over to you to do that.
Brilliant, thank you, Teresa. So if I can have the next slide, please. So looking ahead to harvest 2022 at the East Strategic Farm, what we're looking at doing is a continuation of the work that we've done this year. So we'll be looking at repeating the managed lower inputs trial. It's really important to obviously look at that in different growing seasons. With the cover crops and water quality and the pests and natural enemies work, we'll be continuing that monitoring. So again, adding to the data set, and then a big piece of work for next year and the final year of the programme is to bring lots of this data together to do some multi-year data set analysis. That will be an important part of the work going forwards. You've heard about David's work, so the marginal land. What we'll be doing with this is looking at some of those recommendations that come out of that analysis, testing it out in the field, but also looking to the future and looking at how some of those recommendations might change under future climate change scenarios. So the network of strategic cereal farms is growing. So if I can have the next slide, please. This slide shows you the network of all of our Farm Excellence host farms, so both our strategic farms and our monitor farms across the country. And if you have a look at the next slide, please. The project at the West is actually finishing this year, but over the last 3 years, we've looked at some really interesting and relevant trials, and you can see those listed here. So the research update this morning has actually just started, but you can join that after this session or catch up with it. It will be recorded as well. So we've looked at things there, looking at cultivation, again, similar trial, similar topic that Brian's been looking at, so manage lower fungicide inputs. We've got the flower strips at Rob's as well, and we've also been looking at autumn blackgrass control. So if I can have the next slide, please. We've also got the project with David Aglan up in Scotland, so that's running from 2020 to 2026. Their research update is at 11 o'clock this morning. So looking ahead to harvest next year, they will be having more trials in the ground. So the current year is their baselining year. It's the first year of all of the strategic farm programmes, is that baselining year. They have had one trial in the ground looking at responsive crop nutrition timing. So this is looking at taking tissue tests and then adjusting the nutrition in response to those tissue tests. So next year they'll also be looking at optimizing nitrogen applications, and then they've got 2 trials that are looking at direct drilled spring barley. So one of them looking at the establishment depth, and then the other one looking at the role of cover crops as well. then the next slide, please, is it's an exciting new addition to the Strategic Farm programme. So the Strategic Farm in the South is hosted by David Miller, and it's actually his launch meeting today at 12 o'clock. So as I said, the first year of the programme focuses on the baselining, but we will also have a trial in the ground. So there are a number of topics that the steering group are interested in looking at across the 6-year programme with David. And those are around rotation, so maximising carbon sequestration and biodiversity, reducing nitrogen and other inputs. They're also really interested in soil health and soil functions, so especially the ratios between carbon and nitrogen. They want to look at plant-pest interactions, so crop signalling and the impact on pests. And then the final topic is the start and end grains, so looking at the impact of seed health on the crop performance, but then also looking at the end product, specifically from a food nutrition perspective. So the launch is at 12 o'clock, where you can find out more about all of the exciting plans that we've got there in the south with David. Thank you, Teresa.
Great, thank you, Emily. And I think it's great. I know, Brian, we often reflect when we started this, so it was kind of, started with the East, and now we've kind of had across the network, there's a lot more value that we can derive from that. And so it's great to see. And I'd encourage anybody to log on to any of the webinars on any of the topics that you find interesting, different parts of the country, but similar themes we're all talking about. So yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that, Emily. Did you want to add anything, Brian, or just?
No, you just said my name, so I just appeared.
Good, just like that. Great. So just to finish off this morning, all of the work that Brian's been doing is all available online. The results and the information from the last few years, if you go to the next slide, Christian, that it's all available. If you Google Strategic Farm East, it'll pop up and you can find all of the background and the results if you wanted to look back at that. If we move on to other kind of information that's available from AHDB, just as a couple of things that might be on your mind at the moment, if you've got harvest students starting to think about harvest and whenever that might come, all of our information is on our harvest toolkit pages. If you're thinking about the changes that might happen in terms of BPS going forward, we've got a very simple calculator. You put in your current BPS payments and it helps you look at what's going to happen over the next few years until 2027. A free tool, is very quick and easy, although the results are pretty striking over the next few years. And then the recommended list data, which the harvest results from that will be available as soon as combines start rolling. So in terms of the next slide, kind of going forward, so like I say, today's the start of our strategic cereal farm summer activities. Emily's talked about the webinars that are coming up today, and then the next 3 Fridays are all very much focused on workshops based on some of the information you've heard today. So if we can do the next slide, Christian, that just talks a bit about it. So the first one is looking at plant health with Chris Leslie and the team up in Scotland. If you've got an interest in tissue testing, sap analysis, bricks testing, using maybe different levels of nutrition and getting your plants healthy in a different way, that's the one for you. Aoife's working with Mark Ramsden and Lorna Cole from Scotland to do the infield flowering strip session and looking at how to monitor your pests and insects on the 18th of June. And then David, Brian and I, along with Emily and our Strategic Farm Steering Group team, are looking at marginal land in a lot more detail, and that's on the 25th of June. So you can sign up for all of those events and workshops on our website. So just the final thing to say, we've got other events happening around the country, our Arable Connections events to bring the recommended list trials to life. So you can visit the recommended list trials around the country, and next Wednesday we're doing a virtual tour of those. So you can again sign up for those online. That's well worth coming to, thinking about varieties going forward. And delighted to say we're back on farm for some events over the summer, and again those can all be found on our events page, the Monitor Farm meetings, as well as our series of virtual events like this. So I think that's all from me and from all of us. It's just a final thing to say thank you to all of our speakers, to Brian, to Will, Nathan, Aoife, David and Emily. It's great to share what's going on the strategic farm and to bring you up to date on that. And it'll be really interesting to follow that through harvest and join us to see what the results look like in November. The session has been recorded if you wanted to catch up or send it on to a friend. If you found it interesting, you'll receive the recording through from that. There is a survey that will happen as you leave today. If you'd like to take a couple of minutes to fill that in, we do find that really useful and it helps guide what we're going to do going forwards. So my contact details are on there, everybody's Twitter handles are on there. Feel free to get in touch if you've got any questions, and thank you very much for joining us today. We'll see you soon. Good luck for June and harvest.